Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Sin and Tonic. Today's story is that of John Duffy and David Mulcahy, a treacherous pair. Let's go. Sin and Tonic! Hi guys, I am so glad to be back. For those of you that are new and don't know, I have just taken a short break. Feels like 100 years, but it was not. I took a break. And I'll catch you all up with properly why at the end of the video, and we can get into the case now. But I am really glad to be back. Let's dive on in. We are going to North London, 1982. But this story of terror does actually begin before that, because John Duffy and David Mulcahy met at Haverstock Secondary School in North London. And in life sometimes, isn't it funny how things work out and you just think, if only they didn't meet, or if only I had been 1 minute later or 1 minute earlier or whatever, when things go wrong or situations occur and you just, what if only, that sort of thing. It sucks, doesn't it? And that is the case with this, because wow, if only they had not been at school together at that time, because it's just a terrible, terrible friendship. Duffy was described as a loner. He was often seen wearing like his duffel jacket with the hood up, head down. He was bullied very badly by some older boys. And I always find that I just find bullying, it just does my head in, because just stop. If the world had no bullying and no abusive parents, what a world we would live in. It always seems to be the root of so much evil, those two things. We need to banish those. Because Duffy was bullied so awfully, it made him it isolated him, and it does, doesn't it? He became a very isolated child. And then he met Mulcahy, and I do apologise if I'm saying that incorrectly. I find that word really name tricky. Like, it's annoying me. I hate that, but I do. Mulcahy. And I always wonder how these things begin, how they pan out. They became friends. They were both equally loners and isolated, and they came together. And that could be beautiful, couldn't it? That could be a lovely thing. These two children that have been bullied, that are isolated, lonely, come together. Why not play chess? But they bonded over the torture and abuse of animals. Great. Mulcahy, who was later described as being the more violent of the two men, he was witnessed at secondary school, inflicting pain, and he ended up killing a hedgehog with a cricket ball. And it's just awful, isn't it? I hate it. But this is often associated like a precursor to adults that then go on to commit murder and heinous crimes. And in this case, that was true. Spoiler alert. These two boys became incredibly close. They were like brothers to each other, and they made a pact back in secondary school that they would not grass each other up or snitch on each other. So they were doing naughty things and horrible things as well with animals. And there was a fierce loyalty between the pair. I suppose when you have both come from a situation where you've been lonely and isolated and not had any friends, and then you have a friend, that's a strong bond. They really did enjoy deriving pleasure from other people's pain and animals' pain. When it came to people, the first thing that they sort of did was they got a bit older and they started to go and hang out at Hampstead Heath at night time, and they would jump out and scare the living daylights out of people. And it sounds quite innocent, but that's terrifying, isn't it? Actually, in the night, walking along, minding your business, being in the park, whatever you're doing, partners, couples together, having a nice time, and then two men, boys, I think at that point, teenagers, jumping out, just, like I said, go and play chess, I don't know, do something else. As often is the case in these cases, things progress, like fantasies and sadistic ways seem to like scoot along, follow a trajectory. The pair then started to become interested. New hobby was how to kidnap people and hold people hostage. Duffy, in particular, he showed an interest in the army and in martial arts, fancied himself a Jason Bourne. And then there was like a lull in their madness, in their reign of terror. At this point, they seemed to sort of go off and start lives separately. They both got married within a year of each other in 1977 and 1978, and they got jobs. So they became functioning members of society. Mulcahy became a plasterer and Duffy a carpenter. And he worked for a number of different companies, one of which was British Rail. Like I said, it feels like they took a pause from their antics, because they got married, they left school, they got married, they got themselves into careers, into jobs and trades. Well, they both were trades, weren't they? So a carpenter and a plasterer. And it feels like I couldn't find any mention of things. Were they still jumping out at people at the park? I'm not sure. Were they just drinking and, they were meeting their wives, obviously, and they were training. So maybe that they were busy. They were busy. Maybe that's the key. Stay busy. And then 1982 rolls around. They're settled in their jobs. They're settled in their marriages. What next? I tell you now, it wasn't taking up chess. Like I said, with the whole trajectory, that's hard to say, that word, it really feels like they didn't just pick up where they left off. Did they have a discussion? Late at night, a 22-year-old woman was walking home from a party and the pair were out and they saw this woman. This was in Kilburn, North London. It was late at night and Duffy and Mulcahy, they pulled this woman, this unsuspecting woman, into a shed. They stripped her, they blindfolded her, and then they both R-worded her. So they have progressed from jumping out on people and scaring them to removing somebody from their walk home, like taking them off of the streets and R-wording. It does feel like quite a jump, but often these things, it does sort of play out like that, doesn't it? Oh, what if? What's next? It's like steps up, isn't it? It just always makes me think, what was that conversation? How did that... They were obviously very, very, very comfortable with each other. They were very close, and they had been since secondary school. And they did share, they've already gone to one level, like hurting animals, and the other, like, I imagine Mulcahy was it sounds like, from what I read, he was the one that began this inflicting of harm on animals, and then you're either in or you're out, aren't you, at that point? And Duffy was in. He was like, oh, okay, like, cool. And they fed off of each other, and it just spiraled. And then what's next? What's next? You could say they both shared like a hobby of inflicting terror on animals and people. They enjoyed that, and they shared that interest, if you can call it that. That sadistic interest in making people feel scared, making animals feel scared, people feel scared, and they shared that together. So it's like anything, I guess, like when you meet somebody and you both sort of discover that you like the same books and you like the same things and stuff like that. I guess it's just exactly the same, but just, oh, yeah, I like to beat hedgehogs with a cricket ball. Is that, what about you? It's like that. It's Sadly, this initial assault on this 22-year-old was the first of many, and it would continue. Their reign of terror would continue for 4 years. It is thought that the pair carried out around 40 R-words on women over that 4-year period, and it could be more, obviously, because some people don't come forward, and it really could be a lot more. I've got something in my... I think I've got an oat from my muesli flying around my mouth, and I can't quite get it. So apologies if you see that. I can't get it. So it's likely that number is more I mean, 40's enough, isn't it? Crumbs. Anyhow, in the first 12 months, in the first year, it was thought that there was 18 reported R-words. And these attacks took place around abandoned and deserted railway stations. There was a pause in the attacks in 1983. And interestingly, that was when Duffy separated from his wife. So again, he was busy with his life at that point, and that interrupted, it is thought that interrupted their really sick and twisted pastime. And then sadly, because they weren't caught and there was no evidence and stuff, and also it was in the 80s, so DNA and stuff like that was just not, it wasn't a thing. So they were just at large, basically, and they carried on. So in 1984, they continued. And then in 1985, there was one particular night where 3 women were R-worded in the same night. And well, that's just that's an escalation, isn't it? And because they were doing this together, one of them would be a lookout for the other one, and then the other one would be a lookout for the other person. So it meant that there was always they had this sort of safety net, if you like, because if one of them who was keeping a lookout saw somebody coming, they would have just run. They would have run away, and they probably, the likelihood of being, no one would know what was going on, would they? They'd just see 2 blokes running. I guess in a way, and this probably gave them confidence, because they would have felt invincible. They had done this so many times. So from the 1982 all the way up to 1985 with a break, they were just getting away with this over and over again, and it builds a confidence, doesn't it, I suppose, where you feel untouchable, uncatchable. The police set up Operation Heart at that point in 1985, I believe it was. Might have been earlier than that, and they set it up to catch. They did think that this was the work of one person. They had no idea, and in the papers and stuff, he was called the railway R-wordist. The police had no idea that it was 2 men. So many of these attacks were happening at abandoned, discarded, whatever you want to call it, train stations. So they were scouting out, keeping watch, and they're abandoned. There's no one there. I mean, terrifying, actually. Really scary anyway. And they were heartless attacks. The 2 men would flip a coin to decide who would R-word the victim first. It was said that later on that they normalised their behaviour. It was almost like they were just treating it as if they were just 2 men, 2 lads on a night out, like on the pool. Like, no, it wasn't consensual. This wasn't pulling women, but in their minds, probably, I guess, it's a bit of denial, wasn't it? Like, oh, it's not that bad. They normalised their behaviour. And I think that makes it even more frightening for the victim as well. Just being in that situation, being pulled off of the street, being in a scary abandoned railway station for a start, like that's like out of a horror movie, isn't it? And then to be with these men, 2 men as well. So your chances of getting away in that situation are just really diminished. Somewhere that people can't hear you, just really terrifying. But then for those people to be acting like this is just another Tuesday night, another like, just like it's no thing, is frightening. Because I think because of how nonchalant they were about the whole thing, it almost, it's like, what if they think this is okay, what are they going to do to me? It was said that Duffy leant more towards a sexual violence sort of fantasy tendency. That was where he was at, and therefore the R-wording of women was enough to satisfy his fantasies, and that was his level. But Mulcahy, he had always been the more violent and more sadistic of the pair, so the R-wording of their victims just wasn't quite enough to satiate or satisfy his fantasies and his sadistic desires wasn't enough. He was the one that needed he really fed on the terror and the maximum terror of the animals and people, women. Like I said, the pair felt invincible, untouchable, and they were they were growing in their confidence, and it was sick. They had broken into a car, they'd stolen stuff out of a car, and they'd stolen a tape that had Thriller, Michael Jackson's Thriller, and they would drive around stalking, looking for victims. So again, it's like progressed even more. Now they're like hunting women. So rather than it being an opportunist thing, like, oh, someone's walking past and we'll grab them, this became a hunting expedition while they're playing Michael Jackson's Thriller in a car. It's just something else. Now, there was Operation Heart that was going on behind the scenes, and I just did have a thought, because if they knew, these guys were being quite brazen. Maybe this is maybe really unfair of me to say on the police department here, but I'm going to say it. Because if they knew that these R words were happening in specific abandoned, deserted train stations, what about a stakeout? Do you know what I mean? Or did they stop and abandon that? But I don't think they did. But if it's like in the freaking newspaper, like the railway R wordist, it's like, well, why not stake out the train station? Maybe, I don't know. I just had that thought. Anyway, if it pops in, it's likely to come out. And I just thought, I wonder why. So Operation Heart was going on. And Duffy, so like I said, Duffy out of the pair was more sexual violence. That was his bag. And he had a wife, and his wife had left. They had separated in 1983 because of his violent behaviour towards her. And she had contacted the police on numerous occasions about this behaviour and about his violence towards her, domestic violence, sexual violence. And so he was in their system basically as a sex offender because he was sexually abusing his wife. Duffy was then brought in for questioning as part of Operation Heart. Without DNA and all of that business, it's difficult. How can you prove that this person, and also there are a lot of sex offenders, and they were speaking to all of them. How do you prove that one of those people is committing these crimes other than hope that they confess? And that did not happen. Duffy did not confess. The police did do lineups, and Duffy was included in the lineup, and he was never picked out. And I think that was their line of inquiry, hoping that somebody, a victim, would be able to pick out their attacker from a lineup, but they were terrified. The first victim was blindfolded, so whether they blindfolded other victims as well, it's dark, late at night. That's really difficult to be thinking, oh, I need to remember what this guy looks like, and also, would you want to look? Mulcahy was also brought in for questioning, so I'm not sure whether he had a previous offence on record to do with women and violence. Maybe so, but he was also released. What they were doing and their crimes, what they were committing, they were more feeding into Duffy's desires and fantasies of tactical things and evading police and sexual violence. And that was enough for him. That was feeding him. However, that was not enough. Like I said before, that was not enough for Mulcahy. And that is why things progressed to the next level. And at this point, by now, the pair were in it, they were loyal, they were brothers in arms. Like I said, they were it was a codependent relationship, massively. They were all that each other had, and all that each other had ever had. And that meant that when things upped, like when Mulcahy upped the ante, Duffy was all in. And things progressed from attacking and R-wording to murder in 1985. It was the 29th of December, and 19-year-old Alison Day was walking in the evening to go and meet her boyfriend. And it's so tragic because it's believed that on her walk she got off of the train, she walked to a phone box, and then after that she took a wrong turn. So she went the wrong way, and that led her directly to Duffy and Mulcahy. And this attack started out as all of the others had started out. One would keep watch, they'd obviously flip the coin, they were carrying out their MO. Terrifying, and on this young woman. And then something changed, and it's not known whether this was on purpose or by accident, but Mulcahy used Duffy's name. And some people, experts, believe that that was on purpose to justify her murder. She knows your name. What are we going to do? We have no choice. That sort of thing. It's also thought that Mulcahy was the leader. He was the one in charge. Duffy was, more subservient to him. And therefore, Duffy he would look up to him. And there's a part of that dynamic where Duffy would want to prove that he was okay with something. And oh no, that's, it doesn't bother me. That sort of thing. So this was another chance for Mulcahy to test him a bit. Like, how's he going to react? How is he going to be if, on this occasion, we murder somebody? Is it going to, like testing the water, which is just, it's so weird to use phrases that are so normal in life for something that's so abnormal, because it's so like, wow, who does that? But that's what I mean. It was like that. He was testing the water, like, how's this going to go down? Sadly, it was okay with Duffy. And this was the first of more murders. Alison was strangled. Her body was then dumped into the river, and they had put stones and rocks in her pockets to try and weigh her body down. And again, this would become their MO. The R-wording of the victims was satisfying Duffy's sadistic desires, and the murder of the victims was satisfying Mulcahy's. With each victim, they would be strangled with rope, and in some cases there would be a sock that was pushed down the victim's throat. The second murder that took place was in Hawley in Surrey, which is like a more affluent area, which again to me just screams of escalation and a brazenness and confidence. It would take place on the 17th of April in 1986. Some good things happened in 1986, just saying. Sadly, this victim was 15 years old, and she was a Dutch schoolgirl. And this took place in the afternoon. She was cycling, she was on her bike, and she was going to buy sweets. The pair must have seen her or noticed her, but ahead of time, so they tied string across her where she was going to cycle so that she would fall off of her bike. So it's very premeditated. Again, it was that she was hunted. She saw the string, so she got off of her bike to remove it or carry her bike over, and that is when she was ambushed. She was dragged quite away into woodland, into a secluded area where they carried out their normal MO, and then she was strangled with the same tourniquet that was used on Alison Day. And then I'm guessing there was no river nearby, because then to cover up their crime and get rid of evidence, they then set fire to her body. I had to strip off, I'm getting hot. And this is where the case gets interesting, because they left in their wisdom, like I say, isn't it always good that they're not the sharpest tool in the box? They left the string and they left matches at the crime scene. Clever. And the string that they had used was a very specific string, som yarn, I believe. So it was rare. It wasn't just your average bog standard string. So that was a mistake. And for the first time, a profiler was used to profile. They still thought it was one man. So they made a profile of the person that was carrying out these crimes. And somebody came up with a profile of like 17 characteristics. And when they caught Duffy, he was 13 of those. So that's not bad. Surrey police, they began their own operation called Operation Bluebell. It was such a heinous crime that had happened to this schoolgirl. It was a terrible scene. She'd been brutally attacked, and then her body was set on fire. So it was a big case, and they wanted it solved. So now we've got Operation Bluebell and Operation Heart, and still nobody is caught. And sadly, there was yet another murder. This was the final murder. This was the 18th of May, 1986. And that I find fascinating as well, because what do they always say in Criminal Minds? The original murder, the first murder, I should say, will satisfy the killer's desire for a while, and then they'll feel like they need to do it again. So the first murder was in December 1985, and then the second was in April 1986. So there was like 4 months in between, whereas this now is escalating because the next murder was only a month later. The next victim was Anne Locke. She was 29 years old, and again she was hunted because Duffy and Mulcahy had seen a bike that was left at the train station, and it was a woman's bike. So they lay in wait because they thought, this train's going to come in, and the chances are that whoever owns that bike, hopefully a female, they were thinking, will come to collect their bike, and then we will attack. And that is exactly what they did. And this time her body was found 6 weeks later in a field, and that sparked an investigation that was a joint investigation, Operation Trinity, so between police forces. And this is where it gets spicy. This is where it's like, yes, boom, boom. Because Duffy was brought in for questioning yet again, because they called their suspects, men that were, on their sex offender thing, men of interest, were known as Z-men. Z-men? What? I don't like that. That's too close to the X-Men, and the X-Men are goodies. Can we really? I just wouldn't. No, thank you. Come up with something better than that, mate. What? Anyhow, so he was a Z-man on their list, and he was brought in for questioning about this murder. No, I can't remember anything. I was attacked, I was mugged. He'd gone as far as getting a friend to actually rough him up and give him injuries. And he'd also then taken himself to a hospital to report those injuries. So as an alibi, no, it wasn't me. I don't remember anything about that night because I was mugged. But then he had these injuries and he'd been to the hospital. He went quite far there. I suppose, trying to avoid prison for horrific crimes. What are you going to do? And then Duffy was placed under surveillance. I'm imagining that the Z-men were all placed under surveillance, but maybe Duffy had raised suspicion. But because of the confidence that he'd now been released another time by police. He's been brought in and released again. I think it just fed into his ego, and he just felt so invincible, so confident. And for the first time, perhaps, I believe, he decided to go out on his own to fulfill his desire for, and play out his sexual violence fantasies. And he did this without Mulcahy. And he was arrested because he was laying in wait. He was stalking a victim. He was hunting another woman, and he was being watched by police. So he was arrested. But that meant that they only had a short amount of time to gather evidence to prove that he was their guy. And what's just so, like that what if, shoulda, coulda, woulda situation, of all the times that they were watching, of all the times that they suddenly had honed in and thinking about Duffy as he was already a Z-man, and this was the time that they were watching him, when he's not with Mulcahy. What? They worked hard in this short period window because they interviewed Duffy's ex-wife, or maybe they were still married, but they weren't together at this point, and she described his horrific sexual fantasies and what she used to do, and what he used to do to her when they were married, and the reason that she left. She also said that at one point he had actually told her that he had R-worded somebody. He'd come home one night and said, I R-worded somebody tonight and it's your fault. And that's very telling, isn't it? So he'd confessed to that to his wife at the time. They did more lineups, and many women did not pick him out, but 5 did. The net is closing in. What's that saying? During each crime, the pair had used the same thing. So that string to strangle victims, it was very specific. Somyan, that was used, and a stick was used in that process to strangle their victims, and matches, and all of the items that were used in these cases were found at Duffy's home. They also found a selection of knives that they believe were used in the abductions to scare their victims. I do believe that the strongest evidence was the yarn. It was very particular. That tied him quite certainly to Marcher, her murder, but not so much to Alison Day and Anne Locke. But there was a lot of evidence for him in 5 of the R words, bearing in mind there was like 40, but 5 of those crimes, and Marcher's murder. During this whole, he's in custody, they're gaining all of this evidence against him, and never once did he ever mention his partner in crime. He kept his mouth shut because of their pact. Never grass the other one out. Also, Duffy was the one that was arrested and Mulcahy was the leader, so he would never. It just showed his loyalty, his absolute loyalty to his friend. Never mentioned his name, never at all. And, he could have got a deal out of that, by throwing somebody else into the mix and getting them convicted. But no, he never mentioned his name. He just took it as everything was hit on him. And they had mounting evidence now against him in the murder of Alison Day, because they took his clothing and they found fibres from Alison's clothing on his clothing, and then they found fibres on Alison from him. The guy that he had got to rough him up, when he was going to claim that he had amnesia and he'd been mugged, he came forward and confessed. He was like, he scared the hell out of me and he made me hurt him, so I did. And he came forward, and that was more evidence against Duffy because it proved that his alibi was BS. His trial was February 1988, and there was a lot of evidence against him. He was found guilty of 4 R words and the murder of Alison Day and Marcher. He was not found guilty of the murder of Anne Locke. He was given a minimum of 30-year sentence. And for the next decade, 10 whole freaking years, he was in prison, Whitemore Prison. And not once did he mention Mulcahy. Interestingly, I find this interesting. Mulcahy stopped attacking women once Duffy had been sent to prison. And that was such I find that a curveball, because he had murdered 3 times and it was escalating, and he was into the more violent aspect of it, the murder. I find that really interesting that he stopped, and also I find it interesting that this guy, Mulcahy, the leader of the gang, the big shot, he couldn't do it without his friend. He needed Duffy. And it almost feels like it was like, he'd lost a part of himself. And that is very true, really. They were they were codependent. They were in this bond, very strange relationship. He couldn't do it without Duffy. Also, something that I find fascinating in this case is that there were times throughout their rhymes, where both of them slipped back into their normal lives. Like, they would have a pause and then just go about their business, their normal lives, working, family life. Mulcahy had 4 children and Duffy had 1, and nobody would have thought that these guys had done what they did. They were just normal family men. They had hobbies, they saw people, they were socialising, Duffy's wife knew that something was amiss. But other than that, and probably Mulcahy, I think he was violent at home towards his wife and children. So they weren't normal, if you know what I mean. But in terms of people that don't know what goes on behind closed doors, when they're like socialising down the pub or seeing people, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. It just goes to show the tie between them, that they needed each other. And then this is where it gets even spicier, because it's not over yet, guys. In 1997, when Duffy, he's been in prison now for a while, 9 years, 10 years, and he is chatting with his therapist, a psychologist. I had to check my notes, and he just casually sort of mentions, I had a partner in crime. And she innocently asks him, what prison is he in? Because he's not in this prison. And he's like, no, he never was arrested. And it's just like this conversation unfolds where he just lets it out that he didn't work alone, and they have this conversation. So the psychologist talks to the police and the detectives, and Mulcahy is then arrested. And because it's now 1997 and things have advanced, DNA, all of that stuff, so they re-look at the case, they look at the DNA evidence, they look at everything, they look at they do a whole deep dive, and they find guilty of 5 R words and the 3 murders. So they obviously have found evidence now for Anne Locke, and they found evidence of her murder as well in Duffy's situation, because he gets given an extra 12 years for the new evidence that has come to light in this case. So, wow. And he goes down. He gets 3 life sentences. So Duffy gets an extra 12 years and Mulcahy gets 3 life sentences. Thank you, please. It is unlikely that they will ever be released from prison because they pose such a risk. And Mulcahy did not take well to the fact that Duffy had grassed him up. They had this lifelong pact to never say anything about the other person, to never grass them up. And Duffy did it. So his defence, Mulcahy's defence in his trial, was that Duffy was trying to frame him. He was like, look, he's been in prison for 10 years. He's had enough. He wants to, I don't know. I mean, really, he got an extra 12 years. He wasn't going to benefit from saying any of this, was he? But he did. And the psychiatrist believes that Duffy had, in his 10 years in prison, he had changed. His personality had changed, and he wanted to get this off of his conscience. And so that's why he did it, which makes sense, I suppose. And the fact that he was working with a psychologist, so things would have been processing in his brain. Anyhow, they're not in the same prison. So justice was served, half served, and then completely served 10 years later. And that is all I have for you on today's case. How are you all? Long time no see. I'm so glad to be back. I really am. And I apologise, because I was planning on coming back and then I just was not in the right place. So now that we have come to the end of the video, and anyone that is just here for the crime, that's fine. And I will see you next week. But if not, I just wanted to fill you in a little bit. So I have been having EMDR therapy, which, by the way, is amazing. I've been having that for CPTSD, and it's just brought up a lot of stuff. There's a lot of processing that goes on, which I underestimated massively. And I'm just at a time where I want to free myself, from all the shackles of things that hold you back, that don't, all of that business, and things that were just not serving me in my present life. This needs to be done. A little bit of self-care, self-work. While coming up here and filming is lush, and I love talking with you guys, and I love sharing. This is something that I do love doing, but it's heavy to think about not only my trauma, but then these things that are happening, that do happen, that are really, dark. And because I was processing stuff, I couldn't do the two. And I was like, right, the best thing to do here is focus on getting me straight. And then that was the whole point, so that things don't hold me back, so that I can live my best life. And that is why I took a break. I also believe that there should be absolutely no shame around anything to do with mental health. So that's why I wanted to tell you why I had a break, and that is why I did. And I'm feeling much better. It's just kind of like a busy, it's like the brain was too busy. So other things had to shut down. It is odd. I'm still having some sessions actually, but I feel like the toolbox that I've now built up to help me deal with all of that stuff is like full to the brim, and I feel really good. So yeah. Anyhow, that's me. What about you? When I suddenly felt, I was like, right, I'm just going to listen to myself. When I suddenly felt like I want to get out of the shed, it was such a good moment. I was like, I'm coming back. I'm coming back. Yeah, baby. Right, I'm going to love and leave you. Can you hear that in the camera? ASMR. Dizzy. I'm going to love and leave you because I am getting really warm. I've got to crack the fan back out. I'll dig the fan out. And also, need a wee. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Sin and Tonic. Hope you join me next week for another true crime story in a glass or a vase or a jar or a bottle of water, of gin. Thank you for all your kind messages and for being patient and for being wonderful. The sinners are actually literally the best. You are. Love you, miss you, really want to kiss you. Bye.